The chandeliers dimmed as my sister raised her glass, turning 200 guests to watch her joke about my career in clearing plates. I'm Calder Vance 47, an auditor gripping my father's silver watch as the faint scent of cold BBQ drifted in from the kitchen. Ever been mocked in public while holding a secret that could flip the room? What would you have done under the soft glow of the chandeliers? Every surface of the ballroom seemed polished to impress right down to the rows of spotless white linens draped across the tables. Crystal glassware glinted as Julia, my younger sister, raised her champagne flute and leaned into the microphone. Her gown, no doubt hand-stitched somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic, caught the light as if it had a personal spotlight. 200 pairs of eyes followed her every move, some smiling politely, others eager for whatever carefully rehearsed anecdote she was about to deliver. The air carried the faint aroma of smoked barbecue drifting in from the service doors at the back, an oddly honest scent amid the staged perfection. "Let's not forget my dear brother Calder," she cooed, her voice warm enough to pass for affection if you didn't know the edges beneath it. He's practically family staff at this point. Always dependable with a tray, always ready to clear a plate. Laughter rippled gently across the room, the kind of laughter people use when they think it's safe to indulge. I lifted my own glass, swirling the pale liquid, letting the bubbles rise slowly. My fingers found the silver pocket watch in my vest pocket, cool and reassuring, the last thing my father ever placed in my hands. The second hand traced its circle with calm precision, each tick reminding me I wasn't operating on Julia's timeline tonight. I had my own schedule, and it was drawing near. Around me, faces leaned in to exchange knowing smiles. Elias, Julia's husband, stood beside her, tall and flush, with the confidence of a man used to closing deals and commanding rooms. My parents, seated near the front, nodded along with Julia's words, their expressions neutral but content, as though this little roast was some charming family tradition. I caught a faint whisper from one table, something about how I'd never settled down or always floated from one odd job to another. It wasn't new. I'd heard those murmurs for years, growing quieter only when someone realized I was within earshot. Tonight, they didn't even bother lowering their voices. Julia went on a performer at ease with her stage. "He's always been adaptable," she added, pausing for effect. "You never know where Calder will pop up. Serving drinks at a gala, handing out programs at a charity benefit. Maybe someday he'll find something better than waiting tables. But until then, we're just happy to have him here keeping the glasses full." A few chuckles rose, clinking softly against the glassware, polite and measured. I met a guest's eyes across the room, an older man, maybe in his 60s, who gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Pity, perhaps, or curiosity. I gave him a faint smile, one corner of my mouth lifting, and turned my gaze back toward Julia as if none of it touched me. The chandelier's light painted halos on the polished floor, catching the faint scratches where servers' carts had passed earlier in the day. The scent of barbecue smoke from the kitchen clung briefly each time the doors swung open, reminding me that beneath all this spectacle, someone was still working over a grill sweat on their brow. I took a slow breath, steadying myself with the rhythm of the pocket watch against my palm. 8:47 p.m. The ornate clock above the bar confirmed it in brass numerals, its hands moving just slightly behind the tick of my father's watch. 13 minutes. I could hear the hum of the ventilation system overhead, the faint hiss of a soda gun from a distant bar. All sounds more grounding than Julia's lilting voice. I let my eyes wander over the tables, the floral arrangements, the way people leaned in when Julia's tone shifted to something mock sincere. None of them saw me beyond the surface. They never had. That was fine. There was a certain clarity in being underestimated, a patience you develop when you know a chapter is about to turn, but no one else has read that far ahead. The watch's ticking seemed louder now, like it was marking more than seconds, like it was keeping count of every look, every smirk, every whispered aside. Julia's voice rose slightly, signaling she was approaching the end of her toast. "So here's to my brother who keeps us all grounded." "Maybe someday, Calder, you'll find something a little more permanent than serving hors d'oeuvres. But until then, we'll always save you a seat, preferably near the kitchen, where you're most comfortable." More chuckles, a few awkward coughs, from those unsure if they should laugh. The older man across the room looked at me again, his brow furrowed as if he sensed something didn't quite align with the narrative Julia was spinning. I kept my face calm, my shoulders easy, sipping from my glass, as though her words rolled off me like condensation down the stem of the flute. Inside, the ticking grew louder. I rolled the watch in my hand, feeling the familiar etching along its edge, the spot where the metal had worn smooth from years of my father's thumb. I glanced again at the ballroom clock, the minute hand creeping toward the top. 13 minutes, then 12 and counting. I didn't need to speak, didn't need to correct her, or the smirking faces. Time would do that work for me soon enough. I set my glass down gently, the sound almost imperceptible against the low murmur of the crowd. The chandeliers seemed to dim ever so slightly as a cloud passed outside. Or maybe it was just my focus, narrowing my awareness, tightening on the watch and the clock beyond. I leaned back in my chair, drawing one slow breath, and let my gaze rest on Julia as she raised her flute to signal the end of her remarks. In my mind, the words repeated steady as the watch's heartbeat, 13 more minutes. Just 13. The moment Julia's toast faded and the last polite chuckles died down, I slipped through the ballroom doors and into the hallway. The shift was immediate. No chandeliers, no polished smiles, just the muted hum of the air system and the distant throb of a bass line leaking from somewhere deeper in the hotel. I pulled my phone from my pocket, its glow harsh against the dim corridor. At the top of the screen, bold letters glared back at me, FBI Final Briefing, Monday 9:00 a.m. The subject line pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate, as if to remind me what all of this waiting was really for. My thumb hovered over the notification, while the faint strains of music and laughter drifted from behind the closed doors, muffled like a world I wasn't quite part of anymore. The longer I stared at the email, the colder the corridor felt. 2 years. It had taken me that long to get here from those first frozen months in 2019, when I'd been promoted to Chief Internal Auditor at Mid-North Energy. I can still see the streets of St. Paul back then, the plows pushing grimy snowbanks aside the brittle sting of wind on my face when I left the office long after midnight. The company headquarters rose against the winter sky, its glass walls reflecting nothing but darkness at that hour. I used to warm my hands on a paper cup of gas station coffee as I flipped through stacks of invoices, red pen hovering over numbers that didn't add up. Transaction logs wiped clean payments rerouted to accounts no one could explain. The kind of patterns you don't stumble on by accident, the kind you know will pull you into a place you can't unsee. In those early days, I sat alone in the audit room with only the hum of fluorescent lights for company, the smell of stale pizza clinging to the air from some intern's forgotten dinner. Franklin Dorr, my closest confidant, would shuffle in around midnight, his tie already loose, his face worn from years of balancing ledgers and staving off migraines. "Kid," he'd grunt though. "At 47, I was hardly a kid. You really want to pull this thread, you know where it leads." I remember glancing at the retirement projections pinned to his clipboard numbers that would mean nothing if what we suspected came true. "Someone has to." "Frank," I said, my pen scratching over another falsified ledger. "Or a lot of people will be eating ramen in their 70s. Back in the present, the phone buzzed faintly in my hand. Franklin's name lit up the screen. I answered, lowering my voice as I leaned against the cool plaster wall. "You sure you want to sit through her jabs tonight?" he asked, his voice rough, a faint crackle on the line like he was speaking through a storm. "I can hear that reception music from here. Sounds like a circus." I glanced at the hallway mirror, catching my own calm reflection, the pocket square, sitting just so, the faint outline of my father's watch under my vest. "Patience, Frank," I murmured. "Monday speaks louder than any toast. Tonight is just noise." My eyes drifted to a slip of paper poking from my inside pocket, a homeowner association invoice stamped "Paid. Corporate account" in bold red ink. To anyone else, it would look like a routine bill. But to me, it was one of many little reminders of how carefully I'd built the life no one here knew. The lights above flickered faintly, a bulb struggling against its own fatigue, and somewhere down the hall, a server pushed a cart stacked with empty glasses, the faint clink echoing. I could still hear Julia's voice in my head, sing-song and sweet, painting me as a drifter who lived on tips and leftovers. Footsteps approached quick and light. I swiped the notification away, just as my cousin Garrett turned the corner, his eyes darting briefly to the phone before settling on me. "Taking a breather, Calder?" he asked. Eyebrows raised like he knew there was more, but didn't dare pry. "Just needed a minute," I replied, slipping the phone back into my pocket. I kept my expression smooth, letting the quiet swallow any awkwardness. My pulse, though, thudded harder for a moment, like it wanted to betray me. Garrett offered a polite nod and disappeared back toward the reception, leaving me alone with the hum of the lights and the faint notes of a string quartet seeping through the walls. I pressed my hand lightly over the watch in my vest, feeling its steady rhythm beneath my palm, and let my thoughts drift back to the rows of pensioners Franklin and I had promised to protect to the sealed evidence files waiting for my testimony. 2 more days. Just 2. The sounds from the ballroom swelled as the doors opened briefly, laughter spilling into the hallway like a reminder of the role I was expected to play tonight. I exhaled slowly, pushing away from the wall, and began to make my way back. My steps felt measured, each one in time with the ticking against my chest. As I reached for the handle, I whispered under my breath low enough that no one could hear over the distant music. 2 more days. They'll all see. The morning after the reception carried a damp chill that clung to the streets of St. Paul, the kind that makes you pull your collar up and quicken your pace even if you have nowhere urgent to be. The cafe stood where it always had perched on the corner near the river, its windows fogged slightly from the heat inside, fighting the cold. The smell of waffles drifted out the door when I pushed it open, mixing with the faint trace of roasted beans and the soft hum of a jazz record somewhere behind the counter. I'd been here hundreds of times, but stepping in that morning felt heavier, as if each sound and scent pressed me closer to the moment I knew was coming. Dr. Lorna Kim sat at our usual booth, tucked near the back where the view of the Mississippi curled through the fogged glass. She had her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, eyes calm but sharp, as if she'd already read my thoughts by the time I slid into the seat across from her. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said gently. Not unkind, and reached across the table. Her fingers found the silver pocket watch on the edge of my vest. She traced the worn etching on its edge, the faint nicks where years had left their mark. "Your father's piece, huh? Funny how it's kept ticking through every storm, even when you thought about quitting everything." The watch ticked steadily in her hand, louder against the low saxophone, murmuring through the speakers. I took a slow sip of my coffee, its bitterness grounding me. Julia did her thing last night, I said finally, my voice even. Turned me into the running joke for 200 strangers. Guess it makes for good entertainment when the groom's family needs something to laugh at. I set the cup down, watching a wisp of steam rise and vanish. Lorna's eyes stayed on me, calm as ever, her thumb brushing over the watch's face, as if coaxing me to keep talking. You didn't call me here to replay old insults, she said softly. You've weathered worse. So, what's eating at you? The humiliation or the fact that it still stings after all these years. I let the question sit for a moment, the smell of fresh waffles thick in the air as a server passed by, balancing plates dusted with powdered sugar. It's not the sting, I admitted. It's the weight of waiting. I've held this all so close, kept my head down for 2 years, while Franklin and I pieced together every scrap of evidence. Now the end's in sight, and I'm not sure what happens after the dust settles. Do I just walk away? The pocket watch ticked between us, each sound sharp against the soft clinking of cutlery around the cafe. Lorna leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing not with judgment, but focus. You're not doing this to humiliate her back, Calder. You're doing this because what you uncovered will keep thousands of people, Franklin included, from losing everything they worked for.
Don't let anger make the reveal smaller than it should be. It's not a weapon. It's a reckoning.
Her nails tapped lightly on the watch's case, a steady rhythm that matched the muted percussion in the jazz song. And when it's done, you need to build something from it, not just gloat over what you've exposed. My phone buzzed on the table, a faint vibration against the wood. Franklin's name glowed on the screen. I answered, cradling the phone to my ear. His voice was rough wind, distorted like he was calling from the road.
They're talking about announcing early, he said without preamble. Are you ready for this? Because once they do, there's no going back to anonymity.
I glanced at Lorna, who arched one brow, waiting for my answer. I've waited long enough, I told Franklin, my voice steady. Time to let the clock strike. When the call ended, the silence at the booth felt heavier. Lorna leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her gaze holding mine. Calder, she said quietly, her voice dropping to something closer to a whisper. Don't just win tonight.
Build something after. Make this matter for more than a headline.
The weight in her words settled deep, heavier than any of Julia's barbs the night before. Outside, the fog along the river shifted as a gust of wind pressed against the window. I closed my hand around the pocket watch, feeling the familiar grooves along its casing, and listened to its tick pulse against my palm. The sound was slow, steady, inevitable. Time's almost up, I murmured, not to Lorna, not even to myself, but to whatever gear inside me had been waiting for this moment to turn. The watch ticked on the faint scent of waffles and coffee lingering as I rose to leave the jazz record, still spinning quietly behind us. The night had grown heavier by the time I stepped back into the ballroom, as though the air itself had thickened since I'd slipped out to gather my bearings. The chandeliers above burned a little lower, now their golden light softened to something closer to amber. Shadows stretched long across the polished floor where servers moved quietly, clearing dishes and topping off glasses. The band had slipped into something slower, a muted melody that filled the spaces between murmurs. I eased back into my seat at a side table just as Julia, flawless in her gown, glanced over her shoulder. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Maybe Calder should bus a few tables, she said loud enough for half the room to hear her voice, laced with a sweetness that didn't bother disguising the sting. It's what he's good at. A ripple of laughter followed, hesitant at first, then picking up as a few people decided it was safe to play along. I felt my jaw tighten, though my face stayed neutral, the same faintly polite mask I'd worn all evening. That mask was habit now carved by years of letting them believe whatever story suited their comfort. But beneath it something shifted. As the last chuckles died down, I felt it a subtle tug at my side, the faintest slide of metal against fabric. The pocket watch, my father's watch, slipped free of its place. I knew the weight of it so well that the absence felt louder than the noise in the room. My hand darted instinctively, but too late. A dull, distinct crack rang out. As it hit the gleaming floor, a sharp note that sliced through the hum of conversation and clinking utensils. The band faltered mid-measure. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint hum of the air vents above, and the soft, almost imperceptible hiss of the champagne still bubbling in flutes. Every head within earshot turned toward the noise. The silver watch lay face up, its glass cracked through the center like a fracture in ice. I bent down slowly, the room's silence stretching thin as I reached for it. The second hand had stopped frozen mid-tick, as if time itself had paused to watch this moment. I cradled it in my palm, feeling the jagged edge where the crack met the rim, and for a fleeting second, it was as though my father's calm presence had vanished with the halted rhythm. Julia, oblivious to the weight of what had just fallen, continued to sip her champagne. Elias, standing beside her, shifted his gaze from her radiant smile to me, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. He saw the stillness in me the way I wasn't looking at Julia or the crowd, but at the ornate clock mounted high above the bar. Its hands crept toward the top of the hour, each movement sluggish, deliberate. Only a few minutes now. A murmur rolled through the tables as I straightened, slipping the fractured watch carefully back into my vest pocket. The servers had stilled trays, suspended mid-air utensils, resting halfway to plates. Someone near the back cleared their throat, the sound jarring in the hush. Conversations sputtered and then resumed awkwardly, the clinking of silverware returning in forced rhythm, as though nothing had happened. But I could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. The laughter no longer carried the same easy lilt. More than one pair of eyes lingered on me, a beat longer than before, curiosity starting to tug at their edges. The chandeliers flickered as another shadow passed outside the tall windows. Or maybe it was just the adjustment of dimmers for whatever came next. I kept my hand pressed lightly over the pocket where the cracked watch rested, feeling the cold bite of the damaged glass through the fabric. Each breath I took was slow, deliberate, a quiet rehearsal for what I knew was coming. Then the ballroom's speakers gave a sudden buzz, a low hum that cut across the resin chatter and made a few guests glance around. The band stopped entirely, their instruments going silent as the house lights shifted almost imperceptibly. A voice, firm and measured, crackled through the system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special announcement." The last of the clinking utensils stilled again. Glasses were set down, chairs creaked as people shifted to look toward the center of the room. I straightened in my seat, smoothing my jacket, and fixed my eyes on the clock above the bar as its minute hand slid into place. Time, fractured, as it might seem in my pocket, was about to resume its course. The chandeliers dimmed without warning, and the glossy slide show of Julia and Elias's smiling portraits froze mid-frame. A flicker ran through the massive screens, sending a ripple of murmurs across the room. The ballroom doors swung open with a soft groan, revealing two men in dark suits, their shoes soundless. On the carpet, as they strode toward the center of the room, the band stopped mid-note, the soft jazz trailing off into an uneasy silence. Spotlights shifted subtly, drawing every gaze to the newcomers. One of the agents approached me without hesitation, his expression professional but warm. In his gloved hand, he carried a sealed envelope, which he placed carefully in mine before taking a half step back and offering a crisp, formal salute. The gesture, stark and deliberate, seemed to freeze the entire room in place. 200 guests, champagne flutes halfway to their lips, stared without a whisper. Even the kitchen doors still swinging slightly, stilled, as if the whole hotel had paused. I felt the pocket watch's cracked face press coolly against my chest as I stood, my posture steady. The taller of the two agents cleared his throat, his voice carrying easily, even without the microphone. On behalf of the Bureau, we would like to extend our gratitude to Mr. Calder Vance, he announced, scanning the room. His diligence and integrity have been critical in unraveling the Mid-North pension fraud, ensuring restitution for thousands of employees, many of whom are in this very room tonight. The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water. The silence fractured first into scattered whispers, then gasps, as several faces turned pale, others lit with sudden recognition. I caught the older man from across the room, the one who had watched me so carefully during Julia's toast, placing a hand over his chest, his lips moving in what looked like a silent thank you. Julia's laugh, cut short at the start of it all, hung like a ghost between us. She stood stiff beside Elias, her hand tightening on his arm as her gaze darted from me to the agents and back again. Her face betrayed every thought she couldn't voice, the disbelief, the shock, the quiet dread. Elias's jaw had tightened into a hard line, his polished composure cracking as he made the mental calculations. Only someone deep in the financial world would make the numbers, the risk, the connections tying his firm to the mess now bleeding into the open. The room began to stir again, whispers turning to tentative claps, the muffled sound of camera shutters picking up from the back as a few local journalists, smelling a story, edged forward. The agents nodded once more to me, stepping aside, but lingering close, their presence a calm reminder of the gravity beneath the spectacle. My fingers closed around the envelope, its weight no heavier than a few sheets of paper, yet heavier than any glass Julia had raised in her carefully rehearsed performance. One of the agents glanced at the guests before speaking again, his tone unwavering. Without Mr. Vance's quiet diligence, hundreds here tonight would have lost everything, their retirements, their homes, their futures. Instead, restitution is underway and accountability is being enforced. A wave of hushed exhalations moved through the ballroom, some faces softening, others paling further. I could feel the temperature of the room shift, the narrative that had painted me as a perennial drifter evaporating with every tick of the damaged watch against my chest. I turned my gaze to Julia, her once bright smile now absent, her posture rigid. My voice, low but steady, carried just enough to reach her without amplifying through the silent hall. The evening isn't over, little sister. The spotlight still lingering at the edges of the scene caught her eyes just long enough for me to see the first flicker of something beyond shock, fear, maybe, or the dawning realization that the story she thought she controlled was no longer hers to tell. The ballroom had mostly emptied, the hum of voices fading into the soft echoes of heels against marble as guests trickled toward elevators and waiting cars. I followed the flow to the 20th floor, where a smaller meeting room sat in muted calm, its frosted glass doors pulled shut to buffer what was left of the night's commotion. Julia was waiting inside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her posture straight,
but trembling at the edges. The glow of the sconces painted the room in a warm amber, but the faint hum of the HVAC was louder than either of us at first. I closed the door behind me without a word, stepping into the quiet. The table between us was polished to a soft sheen, reflecting the overhead light. From my vest pocket, I drew out my father's silver watch, its glass fractured the second hand, frozen forever in place. I set it gently on the table between us, the cracked face catching the light like a thin vein of lightning across its surface. Julia's eyes fell on it immediately, and for the first time all evening, she didn't speak. When she finally broke the silence, her voice lacked its usual poise.
You didn't have to do that. The announcement. You embarrassed everyone. The words sounded less like accusation and more like a last defense, brittle and strained. I stayed seated, my tone even. I didn't plan the salute, Julia. That was their gesture. What I did plan was uncovering the fraud Elias's people helped cover. You should know by now some things can't stay buried just because they're inconvenient for a reception. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and the sharpness in her gaze dimmed. Do you think I don't know what he is? She whispered, her hands tightening on the back of a chair. I've been holding it all together, smiling, dressing up, nodding at his father's jokes, because if I didn't, they'd drop me, just like that. The breath she let out was shaky, her eyes flicking again to the broken watch, as if its stillness mirrored her own unraveling composure. I just wanted them to respect me, to stop looking at me like I'm temporary, like I only matter when I'm perfect. I leaned forward slightly, my reflection and hers converging on the table's glossy surface, broken only by the line of the cracked glass. Respect isn't given. Because you smile through gritted teeth, Julia. It's not stitched into a dress or bought with someone else's name. It's earned. And Elias, his firm's knee-deep in the fraud I exposed tonight. That life you've been bending yourself to fit around. It's crumbling whether you want to see it or not. Her first tear slipped free, silent and unannounced, tracing the edge of her perfectly powdered cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. What am I supposed to do, Calder? She asked softly the question, carrying more weight than any plea for sympathy. Without him, without them, I'm just... Her voice faltered before she could finish. I pushed the watch slowly across the table, the cracked glass catching the golden light as it slid. You're not just anything. You can build something that isn't borrowed. I can offer you a place, but not because you're my sister, because I think you can earn your way if you're willing to strip all of this down. Her fingers hovered over the watch, but didn't touch it. Her breath catching in the soft hum of the room. I met her eyes, steady and calm. Respect is earned, not staged, I said quietly. Decide what you want. The watch sat between us, fractured, but gleaming the stopped hand, a silent reminder that the next move was hers. The wind from the Mississippi cut sharp and cold this late in autumn, pressing against the glass panes of Mid-North Tower's 40th floor. I kept the windows cracked open anyway, just enough to let the air in. It stirred the papers on my desk, making them rustle in soft, steady waves. The sound was strangely grounding a rhythm beneath the low hum of the office heaters. On the corner of the desk, a small glass case caught the afternoon light. Inside, my father's pocket watch ticked again, newly repaired its face, unmarred the faint glint of polished silver, pulsing with each second. Dr. Lorna Kim stood near the windows, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, gazing down at the city below. The river curved through the buildings like a dark ribbon, the streets below busy with people bundled in scarves. Franklin Dorr leaned on the edge of a conference chair, his expression stoic, but his eyes softer than I'd seen in months. A fresh stack of documents lay beside him, the first approved lists of beneficiaries for the community fund. His own name was buried in there too, though he'd refused to bring it up. He only nodded at me when I passed him a pen, the faintest smile pulling at his tired face as he signed the final page. Julia sat across from me, shoulders drawn in slightly. Her usual poise softened into something quieter. She glanced at the watch in its case more than once, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, as if afraid to meet my gaze too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "I want to help," she said. "Not as your sister, as someone who knows how to build connections and bring people in. I can get this fund off the ground faster than anyone you'll hire." I studied her for a moment, listening to the faint ticking from the desk. The wind carried a whistle through the cracked window, and the papers shifted again, one sliding off the desk, before Franklin caught it midair.
"If you work on this," I said finally, "you do it under clear rules. You show up early. You put in the hours. No favors because of our last name, no shortcuts. Family comes second to the work. If that's a problem, we don't have a deal."
Julia's eyes didn't waver. "I'll earn this Calder, not borrow it, not wear it like a badge to show at dinners." Dr. Kim turned from the window, then her calm voice filling the space.
"The true victory," she said softly, "is what we create, not what we crush. Don't forget that, either of you."
Her words settled between us as light but firm as the papers swaying on the desk. Julia glanced at her and nodded, her fingers loosening around her sleeve. Franklin handed me the signed documents, his hand lingering for just a beat, the relief in his eyes deeper than gratitude for the fund. He'd watched too many people, himself included, nearly lose everything. Now there was a path forward. I placed the papers neatly beside the watch's case, the silver catching the waning light from the window as the sun slipped lower over St. Paul. Julia reached across the desk, then her grip warm and firm on my hand. Her eyes, clearer than I'd seen in years, held steady. "I'll earn it," she repeated, softer this time, but with more conviction. I looked toward the watch, the soft tick marking the moment, and lowered the glass case's lid until it clicked shut. The sound felt final, decisive. "Time to start fresh," I murmured, as the wind sighed through the narrow opening and the city lights flickered on below. Snow fell outside the tall windows, soft against the gray St. Paul sky. Inside the community hall, the air smelled of coffee and warm bagels, the crowd quiet with expectation. The wooden podium was plain a world away from last year's chandeliers. Beside the mic, my father's silver watch ticked steadily, polished and whole again. Julia stood next to me, calm and focused, no show left in her stance. The faces in the seats, some who once pitied me, now held gratitude and hope. Dr. Lorna Kim sat in front, Franklin Dorr beside her, his faint smile deepening as he glanced at the aid packages stacked nearby, each one a step toward rebuilding. I spoke simply. "Worth isn't about titles or applause. It's about what lasts, what we fix, what we leave behind." My hand brushed the watch as Julia's rested gently over it. Cameras clicked softly, but no one moved. The first boxes were opened, envelopes and vouchers handed to shaking hands. Applause rose, not loud, but warm, filling the hall with something real. I looked past it all to the snow blurring the city outside and whispered to myself, "Dad, the watch still ticks. And so do we. The snow had slowed to a soft drift by the time I stepped away from the podium, the repaired silver watch warm in my palm as its steady tick cut through the quiet. A year ago, that same watch had cracked on a ballroom floor. Now it felt like proof that some things like trust, like purpose, can be mended if we're patient enough. I've learned that justice isn't just about exposing the wrong, but choosing to rebuild with those willing to change. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. If you've ever been handed a second chance in disguise, what did you do with it? Share your story below or stick around. Maybe you'll find one here.